What's up, everyone? Welcome to another episode of the POA Pod. I'm joined, as always, by my co-host, Russell. What's up, David?
Hey guys, how you doing?
We've got an episode that we've been looking forward to for months. Like we're kind of fanboying out a little bit here because we've got on the line all the way across the pond from the UK, Justin Brierley. He's the apologetics and theology editor for Premier Christian Radio. And he's the author of Unbelievable, Why, After 10 Years of Talking to Atheists, I'm Still a Christian. Was that pretty good, Justin?
That was really good. I'm very impressed at the British accent. I mean, I think Dick Van Dyke only did a slightly better one in Mary Poppins, but that was a pretty good second. So well done.
Thank you.
Nice.
I just finished listening to your audiobook, and it was great. I listen to it as I work. I do lawn care, which is brainless. So I listen to your podcast and a lot of other podcasts and your audiobook as I work, and it was incredible. I really enjoyed it.
Oh, thank you very much. I enjoyed recording it, actually. It was the first time, obviously, I'd written a book and the first time I'd recorded an audiobook. And it's kind of weird going from doing a weekly show where you're moderating two people to kind of where it's just your own voice for hours on end that you're hearing. And it was surprisingly draining as well. That's what I wasn't expecting. To record the audiobook took a lot of energy, actually, because you're kind of acting essentially, and that obviously takes a certain amount of energy to do. So it was an interesting process. And the one thing I remember from the 2 days sort of mammoth audio recording sessions from that was getting a really bad cramp in my back, and I would just have to get up and start walking around and like massaging my back, because I think that I was very concentrated, and where it tends to manifest is in between my shoulder blades when I'm doing something like that. So It was worth the pain, though. It was worth the pain. Yes.
Yeah, no kidding. Yeah, David and I both have been following the show for a while. I think, David, you've been following it longer than I have, right?
Yeah, about 12 years.
Wow, you're an early adopter then, David.
Yes, I am.
That must be pretty much as long as we've been on podcast, more or less.
Yes.
We began, I think, on radio 13 and a half years ago. And then, about a year and a half in, we started the podcast, and this was in early days, really, of podcasting. So you've been on board a long time, David, in that case.
Yeah, it's funny because in 2007 is when I got into apologetics, and it wasn't long after that I ran into your show. And I mean, there's no words to express my gratitude to you, first off, because of how much you've impacted my faith, or the show has. But I mean, I think I was like even one of the first people on your Facebook page before you turned it into a closed group.
There you go. Yeah, well, in that case, you've been around, pretty much as long as anyone I know with the show. I mean, the great thing is it's been lovely to see the way the show has grown in terms of listenership over the years, and what began very organically, almost word of mouth, you could say, online, has really started to sort of blossom in the last couple of years into many more people discovering the show, especially since we launched this thing called The Big Conversation last year, where we got some funding to kind of put a bit of effort into the video side of what we do. We relaunched our YouTube channel, and that's kind of opened up the show to a whole new audience, which has been delightful. So you've got the long time listeners like David who've been there since year zero, listening to the show, and then you've got this all new group of people across the Christian and atheist and skeptical divide who are discovering it, and a lot of them then kind of starting to delve into the back catalogue. And the good thing, I think, is that most shows tend to be fairly evergreen in terms of their topics. They're not too tied to specific cultural or political or whatever issues that move on. So I think a lot of people end up spending a lot of time going through the old shows because there's a lot of good stuff there.
Yeah, man. I remember I think there was like 4 of us on that Facebook page when it started. And
Wow.
We were debating a couple people like left and right. Nick Peters, Peter Byram was on there, and 2 others. But there's only one atheist, and now the Facebook page seems like it's just filled with memes.
Well, the Facebook page sort of had this evolution, really.
It sure did.
Facebook itself has undergone, a lot of changes anyway. But what began as a Facebook page for the show, then turned into a Facebook group, which then turned into a closed Facebook group for various reasons. People wanted a bit more anonymity in terms of what they were sharing in that environment, but with a lot of people in it. And certainly it's had periods where it's been more kind of overrun by, you know, very hardline skeptical or internet atheists, and then you've had maybe the Christians come back a bit. I've kind of taken a fairly, I'll admit it, hands-off approach to the group. Happy to kind of let people kind of try and sort it out for themselves. We've got a good little group of moderators now who've been in position for over a year now, who are actually doing a good job of keeping some order and you know, making sure that the worst offenders don't get away with too much, which was impossible for me to do when I was trying to moderate the whole thing myself. It was just I just didn't have the time to really give it what it needed. So I think that's helped to instill a little bit more order and decorum in the group. A lot of people, though, admittedly, are on that Facebook group who've never even maybe listened to the show. They don't realize, you know, where it came from, the group itself, which is ironic. And others who sort of deplore that sometimes the conversations in the group aren't as if you like, maybe as go as well as they do on the show in terms of the fruitfulness of them. But it's, you know, it's a mixed bag, and I've actually benefited quite often from some of the conversations I've had there. Though inevitably, those kinds of forums which are set up for debate tend to attract certain types of characters, and perhaps that's just inevitable, you know.
Yeah, I had some people help me out with some stuff on there because I do a blog and stuff too, and you know, like Nick Peters helped me out on some of my cosmological argument stuff that I was going through at times, and helped me from the Thomistic side of it. So yeah, it's been beneficial to me too. Actually, your whole show has been beneficial to me. I mean, like I said, I've been with it for 12 years. It's helped shape my apologetics, give me confidence in my faith. And like I said, I mean, there's no words to express how thankful I am for your show. But there's one thing I got to ask, Justin, is that what goes through your head when you're sitting there with these big icons of both spectrums?
What goes through my head? Well, firstly, I just think, wow, gosh, how lucky am I that I get to sit down with some of these people, these well-known people. It's part of the fun is being able to bring people together who have never gotten together before to have a conversation, and I just think that's you know, hugely fascinating to hear two different perspectives come together and something new emerges out of that when you get two you know, incredibly intelligent, cogent people engaging with each other. And a lot of the time it depends on the subject, obviously, but I'll be there just trying to keep up. You know, if these are people who really know their stuff, I'm there essentially. My brain's going off in all kinds of directions. I'm trying to keep track of what they're saying and keep up with that. I'm trying to think, how is the listener engaging this? Are they going to be keeping up? Am I doing the job I need to do in trying to keep them at a level where everyone can hopefully engage? I'm also sort of thinking about the timing and where we want to move the conversation onto. So there's a lot going through my head at any one time when I'm in the midst of a recording. The funny thing is, it's often only actually after I've recorded and then listen back to something that I kind of really hear what happened, because when you're in the midst of it, there's so much going through my head that I don't always actually appreciate everything that was said in the midst of that. And so that's often happened with some of the recordings. I've gone back and actually appreciated them way more as a listener than I did as the podcast host, interestingly. So yeah, those are some of the thoughts that go through my head, if that's of any help.
Nice. Yeah, and I was wondering, does like segmenting the show help out? Like, does it help you when you segment?
That's a really interesting question, because the reason it gets segmented into 3 parts, as you will hear if you listen to the podcast, is that it's a radio show, and so it's always been a 3-part radio show, and so it sort of was always tied initially to those timings. Now, obviously, with the podcast, you can go as long as you want. So most weeks, actually, there tends to be more on the podcast than what I fit into the radio side. So you kind of get the extended version on the podcast. But it's still helpful for me, you know, to record it in these 3 segments. And some people don't like the breaks, and that's fine. You know, some people just want the conversation to go on without kind of being interrupted by that. But in a funny way, I actually find the breaks actually quite helpful most of the time, because it gives you a chance to reset. Gives because it's a pre-recorded show, it gives us those who are together to have the conversation a little chance to recap. Well, what have we done? Where do we want to go next? And that sort of thing. Whereas if you're just doing kind of one long hour of conversation, you don't always get the chance to just sort of take a break and sort of think, what do we want to do next? It also helps to some extent for the guests who are on to think about what they want to say with a given. Because if you say, okay, we've got 25 minutes now, and then we're going to go to a break, and then we've got another 25 minutes and a break, and then we're going to have like 10 or 15 minutes after that. It helps to concentrate the mind, I think, on what you want to say, because very often with an hour you think, oh well, that's a whole stretch of time, and we'll be able to cover everything in that. But it goes by so quickly that actually sometimes breaking it down helps people to put their thoughts in a more succinct, cogent way, and you get more out of it in the end that way. So I've always found the breaks, the segmentation, sort of helpful in the end, even though not everyone's a fan of it. I personally think it helps in some ways.
Awesome. So Justin, how do you plan out your episodes? Like, just run me through it, like, structurally.
Are you talking about if I'm sitting down to plan a particular episode, or how do I map out kind of where we go?
Yeah, mapping out.
Year?
Yeah, all that.
Yeah,
all of it.
Well, to be honest, I'm never sort of terribly planned ahead of time in terms of we're going to cover, this theme and this theme and that theme and do all of this in a given year. I tend to be working maybe 3 or 4 shows ahead of time in terms of content that I'm pulling together and guests I'm recording and that sort of thing. But if something comes up at short notice and I want to cover it, that's the beauty of both the radio and podcast side of things, is I can cover something. I'm not like on a video TV schedule where you have to have everything organized 6 months in advance, before it's going to go out. There's a good amount of spontaneity that can be brought in that way, and I can juggle things around in terms of when things are due to go out and so on. But even that, in a way, very often if I sit down to record something, tell people on Facebook or Twitter, oh, I just had, so just recently I did a theological recording between Andy Stanley, well-known megachurch pastor in the USA, and Jeff Durbin, who's a sort of Calvinist kind of commentator online video. And they sat down. I managed to get them together on a sort of call to talk about Andy Stanley's somewhat controversial new book, Irresistible, and some preaching he's done around that, and kind of set the record straight, and Jeff kind of there to challenge him. And when I announced this, about a week and a half ago, the audience were like, and I said, and I'm going to put it out on the such and such, in a few weeks' time, basically. They were like, I can't believe you're waiting 3 whole weeks to put this out. We need it now. And,
exactly.
And that's the age we live in, isn't it? It's like people want something right now. Whereas I'm sort of still a little bit tied to that sort of old broadcasting model of, okay, no, we've got a schedule here and we're going to try and do this. But to be honest, the things that come in, there's all kinds of things that will shape who I choose to have on and why. I'm part of a busy kind of media organization here at Premier Christian Radio. We've always got, we're always being sent press releases of different authors and books and projects that are going on. So that's what very often things will come my way across my desk that way. I have a stack of books on my desk that I occasionally have to kind of, try and give them away or do something with them, because otherwise it just overwhelms my desk eventually, because we get sent, so many books, and that's great. But I tend to obviously pick the ones that make most sense to have the authors on the show and that kind of thing. So that's often where shows are coming from. Someone's got a book to promote and I have them on and find a good participant to do a dialogue with them. Other times it's the unbelievable audience who are getting in touch to say, have you had so and so on? This is a really interesting thing. And that's the route in, and I'll arrange something. Sometimes it's just, a conversation I really think would be interesting, and I heard somebody, on another podcast, and I think, oh wow, that would be such an interesting conversation to bring on Unbelievable. So there's a wide variety of things that go in. There's not particularly any massively thought through strategy. It's you will get quite a varied diet from week to week on Unbelievable. If there does happen to be something thematic that comes out of it, it's usually by accident rather than design. But generally speaking, obviously, I have a remit, which is bringing together, ideally, Christians and non-Christians together in dialogue who have interesting things to say, and where there's going to be an interesting kind of apologetic dimension to it, or Christians of different varieties who have interesting theological things to say, and that's and as long as it falls within that category somewhere, and I think it's going to be of interest to the audience, then I'm happy to schedule it and make it happen. And then going a bit deeper into it, then when you actually have two guests that you've invited on to do something, and you've managed to find a time you can record, then I need to make sure I'm up to speed with what they're both saying, if there's a book that I've at least skim read it, if not read it properly, and that I'm in a position where I can hopefully host a fruitful conversation. There are a few where I've gone in very much by the skin of my teeth without really knowing a great deal of what's about to happen in the show, but sometimes that's good as well, because I'm there to be honest, most of the time I'm happy to be the person who doesn't know as much as the other guests, obviously, and that way I can play the part of the listener who probably is in a similar position and needs to have things explained and won't necessarily have put it all together yet. So that's a little insight into what goes into the making of a show.
Nice. Yeah, I thank you for that. But before I hand you over to Titus, I just got like one more question. What do you think is the biggest aspect that contributes to the show's success?
Yeah, it depends what you define success by, but if you mean sort of the number of people listening and the kind of the way it's been picked up around the world, I think there's a lot to be said for kind of longevity and just doing something really kind of methodically. The fact that it's helpful that obviously I have to produce a show every week because there's a slot in our radio that needs to be filled. Okay. And so I've got to get something ready every week. And in a way, I think that works well for the podcasting world, because the problem sometimes is people start strong in podcasting and then it kind of basically peters out. And I think that's because it can, it's difficult when you're not immediately getting a lot of response for something that you're obviously putting a lot of work into. I think I totally understand that the enthusiasm can kind of tail off. But I think actually there's a lot of value in actually just doing something consistently and putting it out there, because my experience with Unbelievable is it has just grown and grown and grown sort of organically until it reached a point where I wasn't having to do so much to promote it, because people were promoting it for me, talking about it, blogging about it, and everything else. And so I think just playing that long game has been part of the success. I think obviously, inevitably, the more people you get on who are well known, that helps. That gives it a boost every so often. So every time I've had a Rob Bell or a Mark Driscoll on the Christian side, or a well-known atheist, a PZ Myers or whoever, who have interesting names, people are going to recognize, people are going to start talking about that on their blogs or wherever. That obviously always gives it a bump. And every time I've had one of those kinds of shows with a quite significant personality on, and especially where they've then sent it out on their social media or wherever to their audience, you always see a bump in the numbers of people who are then engaging with the show, who maybe discover the show for the first time but stay on as a subscriber. And I think that's been a significant way in which the show has continued to kind of grow over the years as well.
Awesome.
Yeah.
I remember that Mark Driscoll interview. I remember I stayed up late to listen to it because we're on totally obviously different time zones. So I was like, man, I got to hear this, because I saw so much on the web about it, and I was like, and honestly, Justin, it was your approach. It kind of determined how I go about in evangelizing my apologetic. Is that with you displayed gentleness and respect throughout that whole interview. So props, dude.
That's very kind. I mean, it was the whole thing was a bit of a, I think a lot of other people took it way more seriously than I did, if I'm perfectly honest. It was a bit of a storm in a teacup, and I was very taken hugely by surprise at the way it kind of, you know, spiraled from this one recording, and suddenly everyone was talking about it online. But that was an interesting moment, and it kind of is one of the weirder moments in the history of the show, because it's not that Justin Brierley has a punch up with a mega church pastor show. It's the Justin Brierley moderates a fruitful discussion between two sides show. But that was just a bit of a unique episode, and where I got more involved than I would normally get in any given conversation, you know.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so Justin, I recently listened to your show with Drew Sokol on his Room for Doubt podcast, and I really enjoyed that. And I thought of it, man, Justin would make a great pastor. So I'm going to ask you a question that I've been asking a lot of different people, because when it first crossed my mind, it didn't necessarily put me in a faith crisis, but it really made me stop for a bit. And this kind of came out of reading Jonathan Haidt's book, The Righteous Mind. I think you've had Haidt on the show, actually. And reading that show, and his basic premise that people generally form their beliefs intuitively based on various factors in their environment, and then use rationale to defend those beliefs. And as I read that book, I was like, yeah, that's been my experience personally from my own beliefs. It seems like it's how people around me are forming their beliefs, and he had good evidence that this is actually the way people do that. And so, reading that book and thinking about that, I came up with this question. So I grew up and I want to get into this a little later. I grew up in an Anabaptist Christian family, and right now my worldview is a little bit different. It's a different kind of strain of Anabaptism or expression of it, but I'm still an Anabaptist Christian. So is it more statistically probable that I'm an Anabaptist Christian because I've looked at all the competing worldviews and used rationale to determine which one is correct? Or is it more statistically probable that I believe it just because I was raised in it?
Well, I guess, the answer is implicit in what you've said. Probably the vast majority of people are more conditioned by their environment than by purely objective, analysis of the evidence around them. And that's the reality of life. That is the way it is. I think Jonathan Haidt did a great job in that book of kind of pointing that out, that we're less rational than we often like to think we are. Even those who wear, the label of reason and evidence, as their badge of honor, that we're all actually often going with a different kind of instinct and then using our reason to justify it. Having said all that, the point, I suppose I've often said to those who raise that objection, oh, don't you just believe what you believe because of where you were raised and everything else, is, well, that may be true, but that doesn't necessarily make it, there are still objective facts and evidence that you can point to and say, well, is it true or not, and that it may be a kind of completely separate question as to the fact that many people's beliefs are contingent on where they're raised and those kinds of environmental issues. Doesn't necessarily make a difference to whether there is good evidence that Jesus rose from the dead or whatever it might be. I think that the objection more turns on the idea of, is it wrong in some way for God to allow a scenario in which many different beliefs proliferate and that sort of thing, and that's more kind of ties into the problem of evil, I suppose, if anything. But for me, I suppose I think you just have to accept that we are bound, by the reality of the world we live in, that we're all prone to bias and to the background that we come from, and that as much as we can, we try to put that to one side in terms of looking at the evidences for things, but that we all have to own up to it. To some extent, my faith experience came before me starting to put apologetics and rational defense of Christianity together. I didn't become a Christian because of a great apologetic argument. I became a Christian because of an experience I believe I had, and then I found apologetics and theology and everything else a really helpful way of starting to engage that and defend that and so on. So I think I'm almost a classic example of the Jonathan Haidt phenomenon in that way. Having said that, I think there are a number of things I have moved on and shifted my thinking on because I've seen good reasons to do that. I wouldn't describe, the kind of Christian I am today as in many respects, I'm quite different to the Christian that I began as in my late teens, because I think I hope at least that I am open to being persuaded when there are good arguments there. But in a way, it's an almost impossible thing to for any of us. And the thing is, it cuts both ways, doesn't it? So if the atheist comes and says, but you just believe what you believe because of your social conditioning, well, I could say the same for them. That we're all affected by this. We've got to just accept that, and we've just got to do our best, given what we're all experiencing, to try and get to the bottom of it and what we think the true vision of reality is. So you even see that I think in the scientific world, without thinking about apologetics or theology or philosophy or anything, you look at the way science has progressed, and basically a previous generation has to die off before a new scientific model can come in, because people are so wedded to ideas that they have kind of invested in, and that even in this most rationalistic of endeavors, science supposedly, actually there's an awful lot of faith and investment that goes in when someone has a model of the universe or biology or whatever it might be that they've spent their life. They're not going to easily give that up. And I think I've often spoken to people in different areas of science who have said, we won't see that idea change until so and so dies. That then there'll be people will be able to think differently and so on. So I think, like it or not, we're all affected by this. And so in that sense, there's no use one person pointing the finger at another. I think we just have to accept it, deal with it, acknowledge it, and then still try and do the best we can at being as honest as we can with ourselves and moving forward.
Yeah, I did think about it, that if that fact invalidates Anabaptist Christianity, then by that same line of reasoning invalidates every worldview, because there have been people who have been born into every worldview.
Indeed.
So
yeah.
After I thought through that, I was like, well, maybe there's just no way to ever figure out which worldview is true. And so, but I don't want to go that direction. It's just some of these things, kind of make me a little cynical about apologetics. And then I talk to David, and he sets me straight. And I realize even you have said that, apologetics isn't an end-all game, but it is I hope that the fact that I'm doing a show similar to yours, and at least listening to both sides of the perspective, shows that I at least want to get to the truth. I want to hear both sides, and I hope that I'm open to changing my opinion if that's where the evidence leads.
Yeah, and the problem I think sometimes with apologetics is people can treat it like an idol, for like, I need to know how everything works, and this is going to be the way in which I find out. Now, my experience is the more you look into something, the more you realize how little you know, and the fact that there are massive areas which I'm not equipped to know about, things I probably will never know. And so I think the apologist can quickly, the apologist who's getting into it to kind of find a kind of nail down, a systematic way of understanding everything, may soon find themselves disappointed, because they realize everything's much more complicated than that. So for me, I think you have to approach apologetics with a certain level of humility, where you're not necessarily going to discover something which simply puts everything together in the way you want. It might help some things move into place. There's lots of things I've found helpful from apologetics, but it's not going to give me this iron cast proof of God. It's not going to give me an iron cast proof of my version of Christianity or whatever it is. I'm going to have to still accept there's loads of stuff I'm not in a position to know, and perhaps never will be. And that's where I think apologetics often fails, is to have that epistemic humility of admitting that we're not going to discover everything through just reasoned defense and arguments and logic and everything else, and that maybe we're not meant to, frankly, because actually for me I'm not a Christian because of apologetics, frankly. It's great in what it does in some degree, but I think if it does anything, it simply opens the door to something which is then about much more than arguments and evidence. It's about engaging something experientially, engaging a story, a vision of reality that you want to put yourself into. And for me, that's where the real stuff of Christianity begins. Apologetics can kind of, I think, maybe take you to the entrance, if you like, of that, but it's not going to force you over the threshold. And I think you've got to sort of keep a sense of balance about what you can realistically do with it, because otherwise people become incredibly overbearing and arrogant, frankly, within apologetics, if they really think that it's going to kind of basically they can bulldoze someone into their point of view by the apologetic method alone.
Yeah, that's good. Kind of switching gears here to another thing I heard in your conversation with Drew, has to do with the charismatic church, and I found this really intriguing when you went into a little more detail about your, for lack of a better term, salvation experience within the charismatic movement that got your journey started. And because, I grew up in a very non-charismatic household, but when I really started desiring a deeper walk with God and wanted to, be all in with this Christianity thing, I was drawn toward the charismatic movement. They seemed to be the ones who were passionate about their faith. And I was more involved with the International House of Prayer movement. I know right now there's a lot of controversy in the States, at least about Bethel. But IHOP would be similar to Bethel, International House of Prayer movement. And so I got pretty into it, even got to know the leader of the local House of Prayer here in Charlottesville really well. I still do things with them, help lead conferences and things like that. But in the last couple of years, I've been kind of pulling back from it. I've been getting a little disenfranchised with the charismatic movement in general. And I'll just tell a little story to illustrate that. So recently we had a conference in Charlottesville called Lighting the Fires of Revival. And we invited a speaker from Virginia here, just a great guy. And what I really enjoyed about him is he is very passionate about international missions, taking the gospel to the unreached, which is one of my biggest passions. And so, I hadn't heard much coming from the charismatic world about that sort of foreign mission. So this was really exciting to me. We went out to eat, we talked for a while, and he was very thoughtful. He was theologically nuanced and deep, and he was culturally aware. Like he wasn't just this feely, emotional type of guy. He was super smart, and I enjoyed my time. And then we went back to church and for the evening session, and he gets up there and this whole holy laughter thing just goes off the rails, right? And it's basically the whole sermon was that, right? And so, and I've been in settings before where, that sort of manifestation of the Spirit, I guess an overflow of joy is what it's supposed to be. I've been in settings where it's happened before, and I guess been okay with it. But for some reason, I was just like, this is so weird. And my wife and I walked out of the conference that we helped organize. And so when I was listening to your conversation with Drew, and you mentioned that part of your initial experience included an element of that, I was like, whoa, like someone as smart as Justin has actually experienced this too. Maybe I need to change my opinions on holy laughter. But it was fascinating for me to hear that you experienced this. So I just wanted to hear, what you, maybe you can unpack that experience a little more, kind of what all was going on and what your thoughts are on the whole Toronto blessing thing in general.
Well, I grew up in a charismatic church environment, and to some extent, as you were saying earlier, I think you're inevitably very shaped by the environment you grow up in and what happens there. I mean, for me, I can look back on it and say, I thank God for the church I grew up in, even though I'm not in that particular sort of flavor of church now. I can see the way that the kind of enthusiasm and the commitment and the kind of the way in which faith was experienced, God was there and was, kind of on a sort of, very one-to-one level. I think that was a great thing for me, at that point in my life to experience and to have that kind of a manifestation. And, the kind of the holy laughter thing and that I was sort of talking to Drew about, that was very much part of my, an experience that kind of set the world alight for me, and which without, it's hard to even put into language, because these things are, transcend that to some extent, but it just set this fire alight in me for God, and that simply wasn't there up to that point. I'd sort of been, I think, going on the kind of borrowed faith of my parents up to that point, but this was a moment for me when, and as I said to Drew as well, everyone's got their own story. My wife's is very different. She didn't grow up in a charismatic environment, but she just knew that God was there, and it was a kind of, a gradual awakening to that over the course of her years and so on. So I had more of a kind of, wham bam moment. Hers was a more gradual thing. The point is, we both arrived at the same destination of trusting Jesus. And for me, whatever you make of certain aspects of the charismatic church, for me, I've always said it is about the fruits of that. Whatever you think of the manifestations and things, the question is, what do you look like on the other side of it? And that I believe is the test scripturally that we're asked to put things to. That's not to say I'm down with anything that goes on in any kind of scenario. I think inevitably there's always going to be excesses and things going off the deep end. And that's just the nature of us as humans, and this applies equally to the ultra conservative, side of the spectrum. People who dismiss everything and say it's all, none of it's true, none of it, because I think both ends of both extremes are equally guilty of saying God has to act like this and can't act like that. And I just think I'm always open to the fact that God will do what God wants, and that's not always going to look like my predefined picture of what God does. So to some extent, I because I've been in the fortunate position of experiencing something of that charismatic, side that was very, influential in my journey, and have then also experienced a much more, if you like, the other side of the brain, whatever it is, reason and logic and evidence kind of side of things, plus being exposed, just because of my wife and university and everything else, to lots of other traditions, the liturgical, monastic, mystical tradition, all of those things. I found that to be a great blessing, giving me this kind of wider view of the way in which God moves through a whole variety of different movements. I think the danger is the problem is that anyone within those movements can feel like a bubble, and people think this is the only way in which God moves, and that's the great danger, I think, is that we end up restricting in a way God in that way. And for me, I want to say I'm going to take the best of anything that produces good fruit. I'm willing to say God's involved at some level without accepting everything that comes out of any given movement. So I tend to, not be nearly as dismissive as some people in apologetics of certain elements of the charismatic church and that sort of thing. And that's partly, because I think I have seen the way in which that kind of very direct movement of the Spirit can transform people. It transformed me, and so I've got to. I sort of, that's my story, and I can't give you a logical 3-point syllogistic argument for it, because it's a different kind of experience to that. But I do believe it.
Yeah. No, I love the way you see that spirit and truth are not mutually exclusive. That we can have the reasoning and we can have the experience, and also your ability to see value in a variety of different faith traditions. And I think that makes you a real gift to the body of Christ, for sure. I do want to pop a few more unrelated questions at you before we wrap things up.
Yeah, of course.
As I mentioned before, I grew up in an Anabaptist home, and one thing that I argue with David about constantly is nonviolence versus the just war theory. So do you have a position on that?
It's one I'm still sorting through, I'd say. I've done a couple of shows on that over the years, and in fact, I'm setting a new one up. I don't know when this will broadcast, but in July I'm going to be recording with Bruxy KV, who's Yeah, I'm sure you're familiar with him if you're a Mennonite by background. He runs the meeting house in Toronto and is over for our Unbelievable conference here in the UK in July. And so I'll be fascinating to hear him with his perspective, you know, from pacifist point of view, with someone who maybe does subscribe to just war theory. It's an area where I haven't yet been convinced that the Christian call is to a completely pacifistic approach. I suppose that comes down as much as anything to the fact that I know how I would respond in a situation where my closest ones were in some way being threatened, and that I suppose is a very instinctive kind of driver of and maybe I shouldn't be, because perhaps the Christian ethic should ultimately supersede that. I think perhaps where it's most important though is I do see why this is a very even more pressing an issue, I think, in the US context, where I think there's been a lot more perhaps than there has been here of a marriage of a certain kind of American imperial sort of power with a kind of Christian framework, and sort of the idea of American patriotism and identity being woven in with Christian identity, and I think that's where a lot of theologians like Stanley Hauerwas and others have been responding to that kind of way in which Christianity kind of gets enmeshed with a kind of power and politics and the state, and even though you've had this separation of church and state, in an ironic way, on average people are a lot more religious in the USA, and therefore it's become more the Christian identity, for whatever reason, especially among evangelicals, has become woven in with a kind of American sort of imperial type of identity, in a way that doesn't exist here in the UK, where Christianity, even though it's had traditionally it's been tied to the state in an ironic way. Today, it doesn't feel as though it feels more independent. It doesn't feel like if you're a Christian in the UK, you're going to be seen as holding a particular political view or view about power and everything else. And so I think, sorry, I'm going on at great length here, but the point is that I can understand why it's that much more of a kind of pressing issue for many Christians in the USA, where Christianity is seen as having somehow been co-opted as basically another force for getting things done politically or militarily or whatever it is, and I'm on board with that, in the sense of saying, no, you can't have Christianity being used. I think when I look back to the early church and what they did, I think it's at the point at which suddenly it became an instrument of the state, and the Roman Emperor or whatever, when it became an official state religion, that Christianity immediately lost a lot of its internal power, because it stopped being that kind of rebellion movement and became another tool of power. And so for me, I think it's really important at that level to disassociate Christianity from politics and warfare and so on, and say, no, we have to stand outside of that, to challenge it, to be the prophetic voice to those who would use it for those kinds of ends.
Yeah. You're talking like an Anabaptist. Brooks, you'll get you there. So you, as we wrap up here, I'd be remiss if I wouldn't ask you this last question, and you didn't actually give me permission to ask this, so you don't need to answer if you don't want. But speaking of Christianity and power structures, what do you think about the 80% of evangelicals voting for Donald Trump here in America?
Well, the thing is that since 2016, most Christians, evangelical Christians here in the UK, have been somewhat mystified by the support for Donald Trump. And it's been where I think one of the major kind of rifts has happened, where we've realized how we're not just divided by a common language, but we're divided by a very different culture, and there just isn't the same kind of political issues going on here with Christianity that there are in the USA. And so I think a lot of people have been left scratching their heads, including me. The more I've talked to people about it, people both who are pro and anti-Trump in the USA among my Christian friends, the more I think I've been able to see where some of the issues lie. And I think, you know, as much as anything, I think I don't think Christians on this side of the pond should be too quick to judge Christians who have chosen to vote or hold their nose and vote or whatever for Trump, because I can see that there have been a whole range of issues which they've felt disempowered from really having a candidate who will speak for them on those issues. And when Trump comes along, and, you know, whether you like his character or the way he does things or not, he's actually got some results and done some things that it feels like other people haven't been able to do. Then I can understand why those Christians would say, you know, actually, I'm going to put my weight behind him because he's actually getting things done. And the alternative, you know, whether Hillary or whatever, was a worse case, you know, was an even, you know, worse thing than Trump. So I understand it. I don't know that I'm quite convinced that still justifies what I see as almost among some an almost, you know, unquestioning, you know, adherence to Trump or support of Trump. I'm most sort of I prefer to see evangelicals, if they think there are some things Trump is doing well, to say that, but to equally be clear on the things that they disagree with him on. And I would say, in that sense, I'm most worried by those who seem to be, you know, basically putting everything behind Trump as though he's the next Messiah. Or, you know, there are some very disturbing things that you see, and maybe they are on the extreme again. But, you know, when you see some televangelist ministry where, you know, they're producing coins with Trump's face on it as the Cyrus for this generation, and all that, you just think, hang on, this is actually is idolatry at this point. It's not just figuratively; it practically is idolatry. And you've got to ask, where are you putting your allegiance ultimately? Is it in power and politics? Because to some extent, it feels like it's tipped over into that for many evangelicals who have got so behind Trump in that way, and they're almost blind, I think, to the way that is, to what that's going to do for us being able to speak to the next generation. I think to some evangelicals, my worry is they're willing to almost burn it all down for the sake of the short-term gain. They're willing to sacrifice our ability to actually connect with a future generation. They're almost happy that we're going to completely polarize this thing. So that's my big worry. Is there's this view that, you know, it's a kind of like, well, they were never going to listen to us anyway, so we're just going to go all in. And my worry is that does significant damage for being able to have conversations in the future.
Yeah, Justin, don't let him fool you either. He just sent me a picture yesterday with a Trump hat on.
This is funny. My grandpa, I was just on vacation, and my grandpa forced me to put on his Trump hat, and so I put it on as a joke, ironically.
Sure, you did.
I was like, when I was leaving, I was like, "Here's your hat back," and he would not take it back. I told him I'm not wearing this, and he wouldn't take it back. So I've got a Trump 2020 hat. I thought about wearing it just as a joke during this interview.
Yeah, but yeah, mine says MAGA, but it's for Make Apologetics Great Again. You know, it's not, that's the difference. I mean, but on that whole thing, you know, it's interesting that obviously around the same time we had our own political earthquake with the decision to, you know, the referendum on the European Union and the choice to leave that, and that was driven by very similar factors, I think, to Trump.
Yeah.
The feelings of disenfranchisement among a long forgotten majority, who were able then to rally around something where they thought, you know, stuff it, we're going to put two fingers up to the establishment at this point. And we've just had, because it's taken such a long time to try and sort out this exit from the European Union, we've just been forced to have a fresh set of European elections, ironically, here in the UK, selecting members of the European Parliament, even though we will presumably be leaving not that long afterwards. And again, we've seen a huge amount of support for the Brexit party that has, you know, only really just come on the scene. And again, I think it's because people are saying no to kind of conventional politics. They want to be heard as a kind of protest movement. But the problem is protest movements only get you so far. At some point, you have to kind of actually put things together again and work out how we're going to live outside of just, saying no to the establishment. And I think that'll be the challenge, because Donald Trump, but Americans, Christians or non-Christians in America who love Donald Trump, the question is, can that kind of a person pull together a society in the long run, as much as they may appeal, to some of our instincts to kind of shake it all up in the meantime. But yeah, it's interesting times, isn't it?
For sure. Well, that's a great note to end on. We had to take the politics, didn't we? We're in 2019 after all. But thanks so much for joining us, Justin. This has been great, and I appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule to come on.
Yeah. It's been a delight. Thank you guys for having me on. And if anyone's listening to this who isn't familiar with the Unbelievable podcast, just search it up online, get subscribed. And obviously, the book's there if you want to read more about the show and how I put it all together as a Christian.
Perfect. Great. Thanks a lot, Justin. If you wouldn't mind, after we hit stop recording, I had one question that should take like 3 minutes that I wanted to ask.
Yeah, no problem.
We'll edit this out. All right. Thanks.